Always one of my favorite times in the Nintendo calendar is when they drop an Ask the Developer interview. And in this particular one, we have an interview with the big brains behind Splatoon Raiders. Now, I think what's particularly interesting here is that while many of these people have past Splatoon credits, they're not necessarily the same group that were leading Splatoon 3. Saita Inui up there is definitely somebody who was the director of past Splatoon games. Yoshihiko Ito is someone I had actually highlighted in a previous video as someone who was not at the top of the development credits, but as someone who might step up. And then we've got Koji Sonoyama and Shu Tamura, who were in relatively junior positions, i.e. they were not the leads of their particular departments, but are now leading their specific development fields. Now, what this suggests to me is that it is indeed the case that the Splatoon team has now subdivided into two groups. Inui obviously has the experience to lead the development because he's led on previous Splatoon games, but as far as we can tell, there are not necessarily many other people from the top of past Splatoon games, and my guess is that as we speak, they are working on what will be Splatoon 4, which is pretty interesting and hopefully will expedite the whole process. Not necessarily, of course, because it may be that 4 is going to be a more significant endeavour, and there might be other reasons why it could be delayed, but in any event, as long as there is a continual supply of Splatoon games, I'm sure Nintendo will be pretty happy, given what a significant property this is for them. Now, if we look down at the Ask the Developer interview, there are a few notes to take particular notice of. We've got the introduction for the various people. In the past, I've read through everything, but for this video, I'm just going to highlight some of the things which I think are particularly interesting. In here it says, as a sound director for Tomb Raiders, I oversaw the overall sound direction, including the background music, while also carrying over my sound balancing responsibilities from Splatoon 3. So we get a sense there of the difference between the Splatoon 3 and the Splatoon Raiders role for tomorrow. We also have a bit of a summary of the series and a focus on the main new thing, which seems to be this time introducing gadgets, which players can use to dynamically expand their range of actions. For example, leaping high into the air, performing powerful charges, or throwing multiple devices. You can also upgrade your character and leverage a wide variety of customizable options, letting you fully explore your preferred battle style. Now, I suppose we'll see a bit more of this on Thursday, but I must admit it reminds me a little bit of Tears of the Kingdom, with the use of the various Zonai devices to actually automate and develop your own battle systems that can work independent of you, but we'll see what that comes to be. Interestingly, they hit the nail on the head and say they would have expected the next release to be Splatoon 4, but instead it turns out to be a spin-off. What led to that decision? And Inui says, we've been going full speed ahead for over 11 years since the series launch, developing and updating 3 titles along the way. We thought it might be interesting to create something with a slightly different approach to gameplay, where you can really savour the action on your own. Splatoon isn't just about competitive play, it also includes cooperative modes like Salmon Run and a single-player story mode. So one of our motivations for developing this game was our desire to create a new entry point into the series by releasing these non-competitive elements, not just as a secondary feature, but as a standalone spin-off. That said, we will continue to develop competitive gameplay going forward. That's why we developed this game as a spin-off and not as a Splatoon 4. And I think this makes a lot of sense. It's always been the case that the single-player aspect of Splatoon was rich enough that it could easily have borne being an independent game, and now it is, and of course a slightly lower price game than many that are on the Switch at the moment. Okay. Ito then adds, originally around the time of our work on updates to Splatoon 3 was winding down, we were exploring whether we could develop a single-player experience that players could dive into to their heart's content, leveraging the gameplay of Salmon Run. Salmon Run is a part-time gig for the Squids, where 4-player teams take down Salmonids and collect golden eggs. We thought that if we could adapt it for single-player, it might result in something hectic yet exhilarating. We discussed developing the next Splatoon game for Nintendo Switch 2, and that being the case, we thought we could really take advantage of the system's performance. This prompted various experiments, such as ramping up the number of Salmonids for the ultimate multitasker experience, where a single player battles them all. I do wonder exactly how many experiments they have made with the new Switch 2 hardware, and whether part of the process of developing things for the Switch 2 is actually just seeing what can we take from the Switch versions and ramp up and develop and exploit. It also seems possible that if they thought there was a lot more potential here, but they weren't exactly sure what they could do in the space of turf wars, perhaps they thought it was worth focusing on the single player element and then giving a bit more time to develop new things around Splatoon 4. But that's obviously just completely speculation. Salmon Run is a 4-player co-op mode, and even then things can get pretty busy, right? How does that work in single player? So yeah, the first thing they tried was building gameplay around placing traps. The idea was to place traps all over the place and to fight alongside them. And they've got some development footage from that where you can see the traps in action, which again, it feels a little bit Tears of the Kingdom-ish to me. And also it's interesting. I like these. You can see the development builds on these kind of videos. So it becomes like a base defense game, they say, and it says we create a prototype where you place lots of traps and deal with waves of incoming Salmonids. However, the more we explored, the more it felt like you were just building a fortress with lots of traps and then watching it play out. It didn't feel like a Splatoon game to us. So that's when they decided that it lost the Splatoonness, so they were going to focus on lots of different actions within a short period of time, fighting enemies, inking the ground, changing in and out of squid form, jumping from one place to another, and so on. Ito says, we think the intensity of the action is one of the game's key strengths, but when the core gameplay shifts to building a fortress and fighting off enemies, it becomes difficult to make the most of that strength. And Inui adds, when we look back at the early days of the series, at first the fun came from the sense of unity between the player and the character through gyro controls on the Wii U gamepad, combined with the ink shooting mechanics. Having now developed 3 titles in the series plus their DLCs, we've had both competitive and non-competitive gameplay, but no matter what, as long as there's that strong sense of action and unity with the character and the ink, it always feels like you're playing Splatoon. But with traps, we couldn't recreate that feeling. I think this is a really interesting observation here, and I think one of the things that I always love about Splatoon is just how intuitive and how fun it feels to play, and that feeling of play is something that I know Nintendo really places a lot of focus on. I have a video that is currently working its way through development, it'll be a while yet, on new IP, and I just think this is something where Nintendo will clearly put a lot of time trying to make any new concept they have just feel joyous, feel intuitive to play in a way that Nintendo really specialize in. So Ito says that realization was a turning point for me, and from there they made a major shift away from gameplay centered on building fortresses to defend against enemies. We focused instead on expanding the range of actions available to the player to be more dynamic so they can take down enemies themselves. As we organised ideas of how to expand players' actions, the concept of gadgets emerged. Players can equip gadgets to charge forward with power or leap high in the air, place gadgets that let you hover briefly above them, and so on. We designed it with the idea that players' actions would differ depending on the gadget they use. And we've got a demo here. It also reminds me a little bit of the badges in Super Mario World, as well as the Zonai powers. And I don't know, there's obviously a degree of cross-pollination in terms of ideas across EPD, even though reportedly they don't even necessarily play each other's games and can be quite independent of each other. But nevertheless, you see the same kinds of ideas or the same kinds of theming recurring across many of the different projects that we see. So I'm kind of intrigued by the degree to which these were completely just innate to the Splatoon Raiders team, and how much there were things they looked at across Nintendo's output and thought, oh yeah, we'll have that. And it might just be my impression that they're similar. Perhaps, in fact, the traps aren't very similar at all. So it says, definitely, rather than having players place traps and wait, gameplay that keeps them constantly on the move with various gadgets feels like it expands the fun of that signature Splatoon action. I agree, it sounds like it does. And Inui says, I think the satisfaction of playing Salmon Runs comes from how you start moving the instant you think. So it's like you're sort of thinking, but sort of not, or rather you react before you can think. In sports, we often refer to this as being in the zone, and I thought that level of immersion might be really satisfying in a video game too. And it's not just sports. Busy jobs offer a similar sense of satisfaction, don't you think? And although he doesn't mention it, ironically, I've heard this referred to as flow state, which seems particularly appropriate for Splatoon. Ito says, "We designed this game with the goal of creating an experience where players can feel that same sense of pleasant busyness. In addition to weapons, players can equip 2 gadgets with the flexibility to choose whichever is most effective in the moment against the hordes of attacking Salmonids. Once a gadget has been used, it can't be used again for a certain period of time, but by rapidly swapping between a weapon and 2 gadgets, players can minimize downtime and efficiently take down a large number of Salmonids. Once I'd experienced the satisfaction of busily alternating between gadgets, I really felt like this could become the core gameplay. That's when I felt like I'm the ultimate multitasker." And so there's more about how they built multiple gadgets and how the gameplay developed. They did find that the difficulty level was off the charts, and Sonoyama says, "I think part of that was because I was working with an early prototype that wasn't very easy to control, while not yet having developed the ability to think about multiple things at the same time. Even so, as a UI designer, I was shaking in my boots. Of course, it was fun once I got the hang of it, but I felt there were significant barriers I needed to overcome, both as an art director and UI designer, to ensure all players could get to that point." Incidentally, and this is slightly off the topic of the video, but the UI designer role is something that seems to be quite prominent in a lot of Nintendo's recent interviews. And I have to say, just playing Mario Kart World recently, one of the things that really just keeps impressing me is just how slick the user interface really is. It just feels really lovely to click the buttons and to see the on-screen text and all that kind of stuff, all the little small details that just feel so polished and wonderful. And it does occur to me that I think this is something that Nintendo has tightened up on recently, and I do wonder whether it has been an internal focus or whether that's just something which is just me just noticing this stuff because I look into it. Okay, so Tamura says, "From a sound perspective, I was stressing big time thinking about how to bring all that business together." And then there's a bit more on this. It says they were concerned about it being unfair, and Tamura says, "This is something we were already mindful of in Summon Run, but in this game, which combines even more elements for some really complex situations, we focused heavily on making it possible for players to understand what is going on through sound. For example, we tried tweaking the sound effects that play when Salmon is hit based on the amount of damage being dealt. We experimented with various other things to make players' actions feel clear and feel cool." And I do think one concern with using sound as a signifier, useful though it is obviously that it doesn't make the game play quite as intuitively when you have the sound muted, as many people playing handheld might do for various reasons at different times. But they say they designed it so that level of business gradually escalates, allowing players to learn the mechanics as they go along. We wanted to ensure that as many people as possible can experience that sense of pleasant busyness. So the whole team worked together to polish things like how easy it is to read the situation or get used to the controls. And they had lots of ideas for gadgets. The team brainstormed freely on the theme of expanding the player's range of actions and came up with a variety of ideas. And obviously we can see a few of them in the design documents here. So they had lots of traps and concepts there, but since the original objective, much like Summon Run, was to collect golden eggs from defeated Salmonids and deliver them to a container, we even came up with a conveyor belt-like gadget that could automatically transport a large number of golden eggs, although they seem to have abandoned the idea of having to transport the eggs. So they decided that that was not something they would include. And so by tweaking objectives like this, we narrowed down the gadgets to those that kept the focus on defeating enemies. Now, it also says one of the important new features they've added in this title is the ability to collect parts and materials by defeating various Salmonids and then use them to customize and enhance gadgets. Not only can you boost a gadget's attack power, you can also make its actions more dynamic and diverse. So it's like witnessing highly trained professionals at work, for example, preparing food at a food truck or packing goods on a production line. It's like they're moving at superhuman speed, right? True artisans whose bodies seem to just move naturally, but even they started out as beginners, and through steady practice, eventually reached a level that looked superhuman to us. This game is no different. You start off with simple gadgets and gradually expand your capabilities as you grow more comfortable. By repeating this process, you'll eventually reach a point where you can perform actions that seem almost impossible. By strengthening both their equipment and their own skill in this way, we believe players will eventually become what we call the ultimate multitasker. Another comparison that springs to mind here is Pikmin, with the ideas there of multitasking, but I'll be really excited to play this game because it does sound like an interesting twist on the Splatoon format. So they talked about the game world, and we've got a little glimpse of their uniform. There's some great pictures in these, by the way. They've got lots of things about the new settings. This is the Spiralite Islands. This also aligned with the game's play really well, so the island setting worked. So simple gadgets and weapons can be customized and upgraded using things that have washed ashore. And that's a great idea, having this castaway vibe. And they say it is remote. You need a helicopter to reach it, and it has a different climate, so it is a different location. But they were able to come up with a storyline where Deep Cut flies there, and they're looking for treasure. And then it talks about how the design sensibility changes quite a lot, and this is due to the Switch 2. So they say, in previous entries, due to the core gameplay of Inking Turf, environments tended to feature a lot of horizontal and vertical surfaces, with stages mainly constructed from inorganic materials. Developing this game for the Nintendo Switch 2 hardware, we benefited from improved graphical capabilities and processing power. This allowed us to better depict organic, natural elements, and we wanted to take full advantage of that. It does remind me a little bit of the Close to You short, which seems like an odd link, but one thing I noticed about that is, although it looked very impressive in many ways, most of the items in that playroom were what we would describe as inorganic, and the note here about it being slightly more tricky, needing slightly more power to depict these organic natural elements, does make me think that perhaps that was chosen on purpose to limit the scope of the animation. At any rate, Ito mentions particularly the terrain features gentle curves covered in grass, and being able to ink over grass is something we didn't have in previous entries. And you mentioned that the development team was set on the game taking place in islands. Did everyone share a clear vision of what those islands would be like? So Soniyama says, once we decided on an island setting, since it would be remote from previous locations, we wanted it to be full of adventure. So we started creating concept art like this, which indeed does look pretty cool. And then, although it turns out that it was thought of as uninhabited, they decided to create this bright, refreshing feel. And it said, we felt it turned out nicely and thought implementing that in the game could be fun, but it just didn't work at all. These are the swim rings that are put around the Salmonids. So somehow with this setting, it started to feel like we were unfairly picking on the Salmonids, who were simply going about their lives happily on the island, and it became a bit difficult to accept emotionally. On top of that, it felt like we were attacking these Salmonids and taking their cherished treasures by force, and then basking in our spoils. And Soniyama says, I still remember the feedback we received from team members about a scene where the Salmonids looked like they were chatting. Maybe it was because the Salmonids were depicted in a way that made people sympathise with them as living creatures, but without any prior discussion, everyone who played the prototype kept saying, poor Salmonids. We thought we needed to do something about that feedback, which prompted us to significantly rethink the visual direction. However, development had already progressed to a certain point. We were in a phase where we couldn't really change things like the lineup of Salmonids or the overall characteristics of the terrain, so we thought about what we could do with that scope. Even when it came to the background music, when we created it based on the resort-like concept art, it had an adventurous and friendly vibe. That only added to the feeling that we were going out of our way to attack these cute, innocent creatures. We started to doubt if we were heading in the right direction, and the motive for progressing through the game became unclear. So we made a major shift, dramatically changing the design direction with the key concept of I've wound up in an outlandish environment. So enemies in the game are tough, and it's difficult to clear stages smoothly on your first try, but as you grow stronger, it becomes possible. Repeating this cycle is a core part of the gameplay. Naturally, this means players end up losing more often, so unless the enemies feel outlandish to begin with, there's no real justification for these losses. By cultivating an atmosphere where it's natural to think, of course I lost. The islands and enemies are just that outlandish, we were finally able to create a proper sense of satisfaction in the gameplay. And Sonayama says, I think that was a major turning point, both in terms of the art and the sound. It helped shape that feeling of inevitability of losing in such a place, facing such enemies. So we tried adding things such as trash, strange objects, and negative imagery, but with the picturesque ocean and inviting white sand as the foundation, it didn't quite end up feeling like an outlandish environment. And by the way, I think this does remind me of an experience I had playing the demo of Monster Hunters, where I was kind of like, these are incredible creatures. Why are we just going around killing them apart from just for the sake of it? I guess you could say the same about Zelda, but for some reason I don't feel like that with Zelda. And I'm not sure what it is that in certain games make you feel like it's absolutely fine to go into these creatures' territories and beat them up, and in other cases you feel bad for them. But it is something I've thought about before, and it's interesting that it was brought up as a design concern in this game. So that being so, we decided to change things from the ground up, reworking the entire design with objects in the environment all the way down to finer details like lightning. We also made the Salmonids look more out of the ordinary than in previous games. Here's the concept art we arrived at after a bit of trial and error. And yet we can see some pretty creepy looking Salmonids there. So it's a complete change. The scene feels unsettling, things are strewn around, and even the Salmonids' expressions are disturbing somehow. So Sonoyama says, although we shifted direction, development was already quite far along, with major elements like the gameplay and the terrain already in place. So we kept features like the water slide seen in initial concept art, but we worked them to look broken and dilapidated and added rust throughout the environment. And incidentally, isn't it interesting here that they talk a lot about how far along they were in development and therefore implicitly that they couldn't really turn back now? It really does suggest to me that although Nintendo have quite a degree of openness to their development staff, taking their time and innovating, there was obviously some degree of pressure that they really needed a big Splatoon game in the first year or so of Switch 2, and presumably Splatoon 4 is quite a way off. So I do think there was maybe a bit more pressure than we might often hear about behind the scenes to try to meet a deadline, not necessarily in terms of sticking with something that isn't working, but in terms of making do with what they've got, changing concept art to feature something looking broken and dilapidated, and adding rust rather than necessarily scrapping something and starting again. So Sonayama says, when it comes to translating that idea into the design, we had to spend quite a bit of time asking ourselves what defines an outlandish environment and go through a lot of trial and error. Everyone on the team shared their own interpretations of outlandish environment, and we did a lot of brainstorming around these ideas. For instance, we discussed things such as the eeriness of landscapes shaped by geological shifts, where elements from the sea and mountains coexist, an indescribable sense of discomfort, a place that feels completely unfamiliar. We also talked about enemy Salmonids that are unpredictable, so you can't really tell when they're going or what they're trying to do. Even the background music in the game gives you the feeling that you can't let your guard down. Okay, so we can see that this was the vibe that they were going for, trying to create something a bit unsettling, and so they'd say that the Salmonids that wander around the islands have a strange and unsettling presence, and you can't really tell what they're thinking. That led us to immersive genres like techno, dub, and minimal music. So these genres are typically centered on electronic instruments, and while keeping that musical aesthetic, we imagined how the Salmonids might recreate it using objects washed up on the island. By doing so, we were able to give the game its distinct, slightly unnerving atmosphere, and I think it matched the concept art very well. And in Summon Run, the music is played by a Salmonid band known as Amiga 3, and in this game, a new Salmonid band, sort of like a distant relatives of Amiga 3, play music that boosts the Salmonids' morale. And we can see some lovely concept art of the new team, apparently called DHA. So we kept the cello and timpani that stood out in Summon Run as the core sounds that fire up the Salmonids, and by incorporating a wide variety of traditional instruments, we were able to create tracks with distinctly different flavours from Amiga 3. And so we get a little bit more of the salt in the Spiralite Islands that make the Salmonids more aggressive, and so obviously there's a bit of mythology that's happening there. And we can see eventually they look like they've actually been baked and encrusted in salt, which is pretty grim, although it is an interesting version of the way that enemies in Nintendo games often change and adapt colours over time. I'm thinking of the way that the bokoblins in Zelda appear in a progressive range of colours as they become more intimidating. And of course, they've got some food-inspired names. So since Salmon Run is essentially a part-time job where you collect power eggs, the names of each Salmonid comes from the kind of shorthand words that teammates would use to communicate about it as efficiently as possible on the job. They're like the nicknames you give to bad guys in detective dramas. Even if it has a proper fish name and it shows up out of nowhere and tries to swallow you whole, you end up calling it Moors or something like that. The idea is to use words that are clear, unmistakable, and impactful when shared among teammates. And Zorito says we like to call it Salty Tongue because it sticks its tongue out, and Salivator because it is constantly drooling. And we've got some pretty awesome pictures here. I do love the design style of the Splatoon games. Also, the Spiralite Islands are designed to bring out the Salmonids' flavour. In colder areas, they get frozen, while in hotter areas, they get boiled. From the Salmonids' point of view, the Spiralite Islands are the perfect place, ideally suited to making themselves delicious. And we talk about a bit about how the word raiders captures the idea of players entering places overrun by salmonids where they're not welcome. And the idea is you've got to venture into these outlandish environments, and yet somehow it always involves seafood or cooking. Let's have a look at the third section here. And in this bit, we hear a little bit about Deep Cut and how they hadn't felt they'd explored them previously. So obviously now they're going on into adventures, and I'm not going to say too much about it. It talks about things that are linked to the plot, about their fashion sense, and one thing I did like is that they'd taken the inspiration for Deep Cut style from the gear versus grub versus fun Splatfest in a previous Splatoon 3 game. So there's a kind of link back to Splatoon 3. And I think it's always very fun when they build on previous Splatfests and use them as a pivot into the mythology. As the story started coming together, we discussed how you progress in this game by creating all kinds of gadgets, which involves using your heads and working with your hands. But Deep Cut isn't the kind of group to take on that role, so therefore they created a new character known as the Mechanic, and they talk a little bit about the development of the Mechanic. And having the same sort of uninhabited island vibe as Deep Cut, they imagined quite a range of ideas and had a lot of different things like the eyebrows. And in particular, there's a bit where it talks about how they had him using things that are washed up. It says, we carefully define details such as how far the location is from the Splatlands, what kind of plants and creatures live there, and what the environment is like, and we even map it all out. When we imagine ourselves in that fully fleshed out setting, we think of things like, in a place like this, their hair would just start growing out, and they wouldn't have the proper tools to groom themselves, so they'd start to look a bit worn. But even then, we thought they'd still find ways to enjoy themselves and express their own sense of style. For example, they might use things that have washed ashore to combine them in unusual ways. From there, more and more concrete ideas started naturally to come to mind. Even on an uninhabited isle, they haven't stopped taking pride in their style. After all, they're young inklings and octolings from Splatville. The Mechanic wears overalls, and we've created a variety of designs to choose from. We hope players will collect lots of them and enjoy exploring a variety of styles, changing outfits to match their mood or gear. And we can see quite a lot of different little ideas there. And the Mechanic apparently can make just about anything. Now, here's a really interesting section. So there are 2D mini games on the hideout ship, and the pixel art for them was actually drawn by the general producer, Nogami-san. Now, if you look at the reference point 4, Hisashi Nogami is credited as the producer, not the general producer. But of course, this is an official translation from Nintendo, and they did have the opportunity to edit the transcript if they thought it was inaccurate. General producer is a title in Nintendo which is normally assigned to the very top of the tree. Generally speaking, you're looking at Shinya Takahashi as the director in charge of EPD, or previously when he was the manager of EPD. Plus, sometimes you see Miyamoto having the credit. Occasionally, you do see other people taking that on. So notably, Sakamoto has been the general producer on a couple of games, such as a previous Rhythm Heaven. My theory has always been that as part of their continuity management for a few weeks in the summer or something, while Takahashi takes some time off, someone else steps in and gets a sense of what the responsibilities are, so that if one of their top people fell under a bus, then they'd have plenty of people in reserve who could do it. It might just be a slip of the tongue. It probably is. However, Hisashi Nagami seems exactly the kind of person who might step up into the most senior roles at Nintendo, and particularly bearing in mind that Koizumi is in his late 50s and is currently the general manager of EPD. Takahashi is the director in charge of the whole of EPD, but he's in his early 60s. We know a lot about Nintendo's retirement processes, and how after the age of 50 people move into a different phase of their employment with Nintendo quite often. If you're not sure about that, then there's a previous video where I've deep dived this in quite some detail. And so it does seem to me quite plausible that Nagami could become a general producer of the company, even if on this particular game he isn't. And actually, it just says he's a producer with the Entertainment Planning and Development Department and a producer of the previous series. It doesn't actually specifically address the general producer of it, but it's kind of interesting that that particular wording was mentioned. So the mini games themselves were developed by a team composed mainly of staff who are relatively new to the company, and Nagami-san joined in to support them as well. And I think this is a really interesting concept as well. If you have a lot of people joining the company who are new to Nintendo, who need orientating within Nintendo, it's a really interesting structure to have your most senior and experienced people, the people who have created the most significant games from Nintendo's output, working with the most junior developers on these really small micro projects, which then get used within games. It's a great way to kind of orientate people on Nintendo philosophy, on Nintendo ideas, without it taking a huge amount of time. And so I'll be interested to see whether other games have this kind of approach. My guess is that it probably is less easy to see in other games, because in something like Super Mario Wonder, for example, you could have a particular type of Wonder Flower power which would be specific to a level or a particular level design, and so that wouldn't necessarily be obvious that this was done with someone who was relatively junior to the company in mind. We do know, and Echoes of Wisdom, that even the most junior of people were pitching ideas for particular transformations there. But it's an interesting thing that they're doing here, and I'm kind of looking forward to playing these little mini games and seeing what they're like. And so it says, since we're aiming to recreate the visual aesthetic of old CRT televisions in the mini games, Nagami-san went and explained how they work to our younger members of staff. I have to say, given the younger skew of much of the audience of Splatoon, I wonder if how exactly that will be received by some of those players, but I guess it's an interesting retro aesthetic. The mini games have a charming retro feel that contrasts well with exploring these Spiralite Islands. They're a nice palate cleanser between busy treasure hunts, so we hope you'll give them a try as well, he says. And so then we talk about skill, and this is where they mention that there is accommodation for lots of different skill levels, and this is something personally I'm very, very grateful for. I'm not somebody who particularly enjoys challenging games. In fact, I just get bored of that quite quickly. I really want to be able to play and experience the world, and so something like the Splatoon Octo expansion, I just got turned off that because it was just too difficult to keep going through. I might come back to it at some point, but it's not something that I'm inclined to stick with once you're having to repeat things many times, so try to absolutely nail a particular skill. And so here it seems that because they're aware that there are a lot of newcomers, it's the first game on Switch 2, and there are people who haven't played Splatoon games in a while, and it could be particularly challenging. Then they've got the Tourist, the Raider, and the Survivalist modes, and they've balanced the difficulty level so that players can experience the key elements of the game, the satisfying sense of business and the feeling of growth, no matter which one they choose. And so they can have people pick the difficulty level that suits you best. And I'm really glad to see this. I will say I'm not quite sure how well balanced all of the difficult settings are in some Nintendo games. In particular, I felt that I was perfectly happy using the normal mode on Donkey Kong Bonanza right until the final boss, where frankly even the easy mode was quite a challenge. So I'm not quite sure what the differences are between them, but I like that they are utilizing these different modes. And there's also an online feature where players can help each other. So using the help feature, you can ask another player for assistance and work together to clear levels. with the help feature, even if players have reached different points of the game, their strengths and the strength of enemies scale according to each player's level. Great idea. So even if a player who's just started teams up with one who's been playing a while, neither ends up doing all the work and both can feel the satisfaction of working together. Of course, you can also create a room with friends or players nearby and play through the story together. If your friends aren't nearby, we recommend using the game chat feature on the Nintendo Switch 2 system to share your screen while playing together. I think you just get F4 for that one. You just hit the game chat mention in these Ask the Developer interviews. But clearly it is something which could be of great use in the game, and I love that they continue to develop different ideas for game chat. I suspect it's something that could be continuing to be quite prominent with Nintendo going forward, even if it hasn't necessarily made the big impact with established fans that you might have expected of something that's going to last the distance. I think where game chat will always thrive is on the new players who are coming to it, the people who are discovering it as just a natural part of their gameplay experience, and for whom it just becomes second nature. And it also says they've offered plenty of depth for players who've been with the series for a long time and are competent with their skills. And it says once you reach a certain point in the story, you discover a dungeon where you can keep going deeper and deeper with no apparent end in sight. It's a chaotic experience where you'll need to bring your A game as well as pretty much maxing out your equipment. We believe those who are confident in their abilities will find it both challenging and rewarding. And it says we really focus on how this game feels and responds, carefully crafting both the sound effects and the sound design. To ensure the ultimate multitasker experience feels satisfying, we've not only fine-tuned the sound effects, but also the overall audio design in great detail, so we hope you'll give it a listen. As for the background music, I ended up talking mostly about the Salmonids side of things earlier, but of course we have plenty of new deep cut tracks as well, so please check out those too. And it says players have helped shape the members of Deep Cut over the years of Splatfest in Splatoon 3. Being able to fight alongside them in this game is an exciting development, hopefully not just for us, but for players as well. We also put a lot of effort into this game's cutscenes. We believe we were really able to bring out Deep Cut's charm through their rich expression, so we hope you'll pay close attention to that. Also, there's a 4-panel comic series in the Nintendo Today app that serves as a prologue to the game. It depicts Deep Cut and the mechanic's vibrant life on the uninhabited island after being stranded there, including the events leading up to the completion of the hideout ship. We'd love for you to enjoy it alongside the game. Interesting things here. So, first of all, the game's cutscenes. I will be interested to see, I'm not expecting it, but it'll be intriguing to see if when the game credits release we see any reference to Nintendo Pictures. Nintendo Pictures have done in-game cutscenes, and in fact, if you go back to their original founding, rather than shorts like Close to You, that really was their original brief, and we've seen that in things like the Super Mario RPG cutscenes. Having said that, Nintendo do use other cutscene providers. So, for example, Star Fox and Metroid Prime 4 did not use Nintendo Pictures, although, of course, both of those were developed in America. Is it the case that we will continue to see Nintendo Pictures, or will they focus on other things? I have long expected that for the bigger titles, your Ocarina of Times and your next 3D Zeldas, we will probably see something from Nintendo Pictures, particularly since Yoshiaki Koizumi is on the board of Nintendo Pictures and has a particular interest in 3D Mario and in Ocarina of Time, but I guess we'll have to wait and see. What their capacity is, I'm not quite sure, and there are other people who can do this kind of stuff, including the fact that they will want to develop within the core EPD groupings sufficient skills in managing cutscenes without necessarily farming these out to Nintendo Pictures all the time. So I'm not quite sure where that will go. Nintendo Today, well, it's quite fun to see these kind of updates. I must admit, I haven't really been focusing on the comics recently, but I'll have to give them a look. It says, we believed it's evolved into a new type of Splatoon experience filled with a lot of fresh ideas and challenges. And it says the protagonist of the original Splatoon game was portrayed as a teenager, and now some of the people who were teenagers when they first played it have joined the development team and worked on this new game alongside us. It really makes me feel this series has grown alongside its players more than I ever expected. And there's several people there who were students when the original Splatoon came out, which should make all of us feel old. And then at the end, we've got Splatoon has always evolved through close interaction with its players. And with this title, we feel we're able to take a step forward with the series and hope it continues to grow together with the players. So, all in all, really great interview, really great deep dive. They're always good fun. Highlights for me, I'm very interested now to see the credits and particularly to see if, as it appears, this is a splinter of the Splatoon 3 team, but not a significant swathe of it with, one or two senior people, but broadly something which is taking a new group and focusing on it. The fact that clearly there were younger people involved also kind of suggests to me that maybe Splatoon Raiders was actually something being led by the newer people as well. So what that means for Splatoon 4 still remains to be seen. It could be a very long time before we see anything from Splatoon 4, even so. If it's going to be a 5, 6, 7 year development cycle to create something truly massive, then maybe we're still looking at 2029, 2030. That's it for now, I think. Do check out the Patreon for more. Thank you so much for watching, and I shall see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.